Okay. Okay. Thank you, Hannes, and thanks everybody for being here. Um, I do have some slides to share with you, and I just wanted to start by noting that I don't know how many of you were on this Zoom with Phil Weber, but I know that he was talking about the role that scientists can play in this whole disarmament movement. And I'm assuming most of you are scientists, since it's the forum for scientists. And I did just want to say I had the previous book, which Hannes mentioned. Let me just share my screen a second. Okay, so my previous book, oops, let's see. Oop. There you go. Warheads to Windmills. I don't know if anybody here has seen it, but that does specifically talk about the role of scientists and engineers in the movement to eliminate nuclear weapons, specifically because of the links between the climate catastrophe and nuclear weapons, and the need to move all the scientists and engineers and infrastructure and public policy and money from weapons of war to addressing the remaining challenges in the climate sphere. So that was very much the focus of that book. But my new one, which is not this one, but this one, Nuclear Abolition. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it was inspired by this book by Annie Jacobsen. I don't know if any of you have seen this one, but it was a bestseller in 2024, and it's being made into a film. There's already a film very similar to it that came out recently, the House of Dynamite. But these are modern day second by second scenarios of how a nuclear war could unfold, and as I'm sure you all know, there's so many ways that could happen, and we're seeing them before our very eyes right now. But my response, I mean, Annie Jacobsen doesn't explain how to prevent this, and she was challenged even in the New York Times about that. So I was hoping to present an alternative that looks at one possible, or several, but one overall way in which we could eliminate these weapons realistically, and finally and verifiably and so on, in a time scale that's realistic. And so I'm going to talk about that. It doesn't specifically talk about scientists. It's about the role everybody can play in getting rid of these weapons, both in European countries and around the world, and within the United States. So I'm going to focus on the international aspect today, but I'll mention a few of the steps that are going on in the U.S. And the whole book is based on steps that are already being taken, and that if we just need more of what's already happening to really make this possible. And I want to start by talking about Trump, because as Hannes said, he's changing the landscape as we speak. I never for 1 minute imagined that Trump would alienate the whole of NATO by threatening to invade Greenland, but I did imagine that Trump as a whole would his policies would help spur a movement opposed to what he stands for and all the things that he's doing, particularly in Europe, not necessarily by European governments, but by European people. As happened very much in the 1980s and led to the phase of limitations that we have been living with up until now. I do have in my book a scenario, an alternative scenario where Trump does get rid of nuclear weapons himself. I mean, he's been talking about that. He's mentioned many times, he wants to denuclearize and so on. I don't think it's going to happen that way, for all the reasons that I'm sure you can imagine, but it's possible. So that's one of the scenarios. But my book is really focused on pressure, putting pressure on the people that need to be influenced, and I'll get to that in a second. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, as you all know, the New START treaty is going to expire in a few days, and Trump's response to that was, well, if it expires, it expires. And this is a picture of Obama and Medvedev signing the New START treaty, and just looking at this photo explains why Trump is not going to continue with the New START, because he's opposed to everything that Obama stands for, and he's undone everything that Obama did and Biden. And so we're not likely to get that kind of scenario, even though it's in Trump's interest, as it is in everyone's interest, to prevent nuclear war. And so the question is, in whose interest is it to not necessarily have nuclear war, but continue with the development and buildup of nuclear weapons, and continue with this pretense that nothing will ever go wrong and nothing could possibly lead to nuclear war, which we know from Annie Jacobsen's book and many other books that's not the case. So my book starts with who benefits from the continuation of the nuclear arms race, and here are some of the key actors in the book. They may all be familiar to you. Some of them are American, some of them are European. Thales, Leonardo, so on, Airbus, Rolls-Royce, BAE. But most of these are U.S. companies, and they've convinced themselves that there's nothing wrong with building more and more nuclear weapons, and somehow that's going to keep us all safe. And it's not surprising from a psychological point of view that they've convinced themselves of this, because they are making enormous amounts of money out of it. And they use that money, a very tiny amount of that money, to keep the thing going, this gravy train that pours billions and billions of dollars into these companies. And on the one hand, they're influencing Congress. They're literally bribing Congress with re-election finance, with free expertise from lobbyists, not only to help them vote on legislation, but to actually draft the legislation. But these companies also have enormous influence over the messaging, the mass media, how they frame these arguments and discussions, how they get into academia and NGOs even to maintain this system. And my wife Vicky, who's on this call, spent 3 days with these companies. These companies are meeting in Washington, D.C. this coming weekend. All the companies with their congressional lapdogs and military counterparts and suppliers, they all meet in the basement of this hotel outside Washington, D.C., and they congratulate each other, pat each other on the back, and explain why they need even more money to do the work that they're doing. And they're now, we're talking trillions of dollars that is being poured into these companies altogether over the decades, trillions. So it's a huge business, and they don't want it to stop. And so the question is, how do we get at these companies and make them stop? And that's where the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons comes in. And as Hannes mentioned, it's the 5th anniversary of it entering into force coming up tomorrow. And there'll be protests and events happening around the world. I hope some of them you know about or taking parts in. But the question, which again Hannes raised, the countries that have so far joined. Oops, wait a second. The countries that have so far joined the treaty are not including any of the ones that actually have nuclear weapons. And my map is a little bit more filled out. You saw in Hannes's map the countries that have ratified the treaty and the countries that have signed it. So the ratified countries on this map are in blue. It's a little bit out of date. The countries that have signed and not yet ratified are in green. But then there are countries that have been voting for the treaty and voting for these resolutions to tell other countries to sign the treaty, but they haven't signed it yet themselves. And those are the ones in yellow. So you can see a lot of countries in the Middle East, for example, are supporting the treaty. I mean, they voted for it when it was adopted. They've been voting for it ever since in the United Nations General Assembly and in the First Committee, but they haven't yet brought themselves to join it. And then there are the orange countries, which are under intense pressure to join this treaty from, in some cases, from governments. I'm going to get onto that, but certainly from their public, and opinion polls consistently show that there's very, very strong support for this treaty. So, but as you can see, as Hannes pointed out, the US, Russia, China, India, they're not in this treaty. And so the question comes up all the time. I mean, I'm asked constantly, well, what's the point of a TPNW when, the countries that are in it are already in the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which already makes a commitment not to develop nuclear weapons. So these countries have already promised not to develop nuclear weapons, and now they've signed another treaty. So what's the point? And that's where I want to get to the real crux of what the TPNW is all about, because it's not just about saying no to nuclear weapons. There's some tools in there, very, very powerful tools, which countries can use. Some are starting to use, but this is how I think we will finally get rid of these weapons. And so the first point is this Article 1E. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but Article 1 includes all the prohibitions. It's prohibited to develop, manufacture, stockpile, test, and so on. And under E, it's prohibited to assist, encourage, or induce in any way anyone to engage in any activity prohibited to a state party under this treaty. Now, that is the same language in a number of other treaties, but not in the NPT, not in any other nuclear treaty. And as you know, treaties are between governments, they're between countries. But this clause does not talk about countries, it talks about anyone. And this is the key to us having a chance to put pressure on these companies that are the ones that are making the weapons, that are developing them, that are maintaining them, and that are using their influence and their money to make sure that keeps going. So the companies, those are the countries, just to memorize the countries and the colors. So here's an example of a nuclear weapons company, Honeywell. They have operations, and in this case, they're everywhere. I mean, they're in a total of 110 countries. You can see many of them are the same countries that are already in the treaty. Here's another one, Airbus. Again, all over the world. These companies do not just operate in the United States or Western Europe. They operate everywhere. They have offices, they have projects, they have suppliers, they have investors. These companies are not only operating all over the world, they're dependent on those countries. And so if those countries start to say, we're not going to have anything to do with you if you continue to make nuclear weapons, that is going to have an impact on these companies. This is Thales, a French one, again, operating in many, many countries. Bechtel, similar. So far, only Ireland has gone to the lengths of passing legislation that really starts to impact these companies. Ireland is one of the parties to the TPNW. They passed the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Act in 2019, which makes it an offense for a person, not the treaty, as I said, has to do with countries, but the law passed in Ireland makes it an offense for anybody in Ireland to have anything to do with nuclear weapons, including assisting with nuclear weapons. And as you can see down here, offenses by body corporate. So this is persons, including legal persons, which is corporations. And that includes a director, a manager, a secretary, or other officer of the corporation shall be guilty of the offense if they are involved in any way with nuclear weapons. And the consequence, the penalty, is a fine or imprisonment for life, or lesser term, but I mean, potentially prison for life for having anything to do with nuclear weapons in Ireland. Now, if every other country started doing that, that is going to have an enormous impact on these companies. They won't admit it straight off, but this is known as a legislative risk. It affects investors in those companies. It affects people working for those companies, especially the CEOs, who might decide to go on a golfing holidays in Ireland or somewhere, and find that they're arrested for involvement in prohibited activities under the TPNW implemented in that country. So this is a powerful tool, and it also includes divestment. Ireland, again, is the first country to, not the first, but the country in the TPNW that has already divested its sovereign funds from the nuclear weapons companies. Switzerland, which is not even in the TPNW yet, has actually already divested also from these companies. As you can see here, this is the Federal Act on War Material, and it includes a clause about financing. Financing is such an important part of this because these companies, as I said, rely on investors from all over the world. And as we'll see later, many banks and financial institutions in Europe have already divested. But when whole countries start doing that, that really has an impact. So we have these tools, and we have countries that are willing, that are able to make these laws or take divestment situations, and we just need to keep pushing these countries to do more. So again, here's the picture of the countries. As I mentioned, our first goal is to get the countries that have signed the treaty but have not yet ratified it to do so, but also to get those yellow countries to actually join the treaty, because many of the companies, as you can see here, Boeing is all over the world, but especially in some of those yellow countries in the Middle East. These Boeing, just one plane like the 787 that's produced by Boeing, as you can see here, is manufactured in all these different countries and put together. So you can imagine a country like Australia, for example, which I'll come to. If they actually make a piece of the wing which is not made anywhere else in the world, and if Australia said we're not doing that, that would put Boeing in a particularly difficult position. oops, wait a second. What did I do here? So Australia is an example. This is the Prime Minister of Australia. He's personally, as you can see, he was at an ICAN demonstration before he was Prime Minister, but he's still a supporter of ICAN and of the TPNW. His party, the Labour Party of Australia, has committed to signing the treaty at some point, and Albanese just got re-elected. He's got a strong mandate. He's got a party behind him. There's huge support for the TPNW in Australia, and that, sooner or later, Australia is going to join this treaty, and that's going to make a huge difference. Australia is not in NATO, but they are a critical ally of the United States. And as I said, they actually make this one piece of a Boeing plane, which Boeing can't manage without. So it would have huge impacts on these companies if they did so. And it's not just U.S. companies or European companies. This is an example of an Indian company that makes that is involved in the nuclear weapons industry in India. And as you can see here, again, they've got involvements all over the world, including many of the countries that are already in the TPNW. Same with China. Same with Russia. We don't have as much clout as we do over these US and French companies, for example, but these other countries do have companies operating on the global market, and we can influence them. Now, the map that I showed you of the different countries. Let's see, where are we? Yeah. I was talking about the yellow countries in particular that have voted for the treaty, and if they actually join it, would add enormous weight to this pressure on the companies. NATO, I'm sure those of you on this call from Germany and elsewhere in Europe are more aware than many about the diversity of policies over nuclear weapons within NATO. We think of NATO, NATO has been voting as a bloc so far in opposing the TPNW. However, 3 of those countries have their own nuclear weapons, as we know, and 5 of them host nuclear weapons. I don't think this shows I think there's some bits of this map missing underneath. Anyway, Canada and Greece used to have nuclear weapons, U.S. nuclear weapons, on their soil, and they pulled out, and they do not accept nuclear weapons on their soil. Denmark, Norway, and Spain do not allow them in peacetime, but they have a clause, in wartime. And again, there's something going wrong here. But Iceland and also Lithuania, and I think one other country, do not allow them at any time, even in a war situation. So there are all these different policies within NATO, and as I said, I wasn't expecting Trump to create this hostility within NATO towards the United States, which could change everything. But NATO is not a single bloc when it comes to nuclear weapons, and I mentioned already some of the countries, or maybe I didn't mention yet, but Iceland has enormous. Well, here's some of the opinion polls. Iceland, you can see 86% oppose nuclear weapons and want to join the treaty, and that includes the prime minister of Iceland and most of her cabinet. So they're going to be one of the first, I believe. I thought Finland might be. The former foreign minister of Finland, Pekka Haavisto, who was a very anti-nuclear campaigner before he was foreign minister, and there's a lot of support for the TPNW. This was before they joined NATO, but still, Iceland, Finland, Norway, like Australia, has a Labour Party in government who has supported signing the TPNW. In fact, Norway was the first country before they had a change of government back in 2016 or 15 or something. Norway hosted the very first conference that led to the TPNW. And then they had a change of government, and it's been, but they're now back with the Labour Party. And Norway, sooner or later, one of these countries is going to be the first, and others are going to start following. Spain, both Spain and Germany had coalition governments committed to joining the TPNW. Spain still does, Germany does not anymore, but these things could very much lead to changes that we need to see. Sooner or later, it's either going to be nuclear war or we're going to get rid of these weapons. And I certainly hope it's the former, or the latter, I mean. And but that's only going to happen with the use of pressure. These companies and the politicians that they serve, especially in the United States, are not going to change their policy without being under pressure. And but we do have the possibilities of pressure. And in my book, I go through in great detail in these different countries what could happen. Not to say that this is the only thing that can happen, but these things could happen, and adding them together could bring us to the point where we see these companies deciding that it's in their best interest to work towards the elimination of these weapons, because these companies, after all, do not exist to make nuclear weapons. They exist to make a profit for their shareholders. And if they're under pressure, and there's a whole set of tools available. I mentioned legislative risk, stranded assets. You may be familiar with that term in relation to fossil fuel divestment and so on, because the fossil fuel companies are sitting on enormous resources of oil and gas and coal and so on. If they can't actually use those resources, then on their books, their assets are suddenly worthless. And the same applies to nuclear weapons companies, because they are investing. I mean, right now in the US, some of these companies like Honeywell are investing billions in new plants and equipment to make a whole new generation of nuclear weapons. Well, if that suddenly gets stopped, their investments are worthless. Those factories are going to sit there, and the staff that they've hired. So stranded assets is one of the threats that we can put on these companies. Legislative risk if they're legally breaking the law in some of these countries. But reputational risk is a huge one, because the value of these companies is not just their profit. It's to do with their brand and their marketability and their value on the stock market. And when companies are stigmatized for what they're doing, and the public is going against them. I mean, they depend on, at the moment, on this idea that they're doing great things to protect the citizens of those countries, that they're patriots, they're working for worthy causes. I mean, and they use their clout to add to their reputation by sponsoring football teams and sponsoring children's activities and all kinds of things to build that support for what they're doing. And if that starts to break down, if their reputation is challenged by campaigns of divestment, boycotting, stigmatizing these companies, that affects their value, literally their bottom line. And same with investor anxiety. Many people point out, well, if you divest from a company, then someone else will simply buy those shares, and it doesn't affect the company. That's not the case. There's lots of evidence that investor anxiety brings down the price of shares. It affects the companies dramatically, potentially, because investors don't like to see other investors pulling out. They wonder what's going on. And as more and more, as I mentioned, the banks and large pension funds in Europe have pulled out more than $3 trillion worth of investments from these companies already. That's a drop in the ocean compared to the fossil fuel divestment impacts. But these things do have an impact on the companies, as does potentially loss of contracts and customers if these countries follow through. I mean, I looked in my book at some of the contracts, billions and billions of dollars worth of contracts. Bechtel, for example, building in Saudi Arabia these gigantic, and Egypt, these gigantic facilities. If the countries that join the treaty say that we can't do business with you anymore, that's potentially a huge loss to these companies. And of course, the workers, and that's where the scientists and engineers come in again. You know, if people don't want to work for these companies because it's not a cool thing to do, you know, that's also impacting these companies. And of course, supply chain issues. If companies down the line, if countries, you know, are refusing to do business with companies that are also doing business with those companies, all these things can add up, and that's the overall scenario in my book. Is that this is not just one thing that's going to have an impact, but all these things added together, all over the world with the TPNW, and that's not enough by its own. It needs also complementary activity within the United States, because we know that the United States is the key player here. If the United States decides to pull out of the nuclear weapons business, that's going to impact the rest of the nuclear countries. And if the United States doesn't do that, even if the other countries do, it won't be enough. So we need to be focusing on getting change at the political level in the United States. The companies are already feeling these pressures. I mean, my book starts every chapter with something that's already in place, like I mentioned with Ireland or with Switzerland or whatever, and builds on that. And the same thing in the United States. I mean, we already have some very important pressures underway in the United States. I don't know how many of you have heard about New York City, but you know, the City Council of New York voted a couple of years ago to divest from nuclear weapons for the whole of the city of New York, which is billions of pounds of dollars of their pension funds. They haven't actually done the divestment yet, but they are committed to it, and we've got to see them follow through on that. But other cities have done that. Oakland, California, another quite big city. Nope, that's not the right slide. Let's see, Oakland 30. There we are, Oakland. Oakland is an interesting case. How are we doing for time? Let's see. Yeah, I'll finish up quite soon, and we can have discussion. But Oakland is an interesting case because you can see here, 1988, the residents voted to divest from nuclear weapons, refused to have contracts with them, and other steps to be completely nuclear free in Oakland, California. The U.S. government took them to court because they said, you can't do that. You know, Oakland is a major port. It has nuclear parts for nuclear weapons passing through that port, and you can't. You know, they threw out this law. Oakland City turned around and rewrote their ordinance to say that it doesn't apply to the Port of Oakland. So they still have this act. It's in place. It's been in place for decades, and they don't have any business with nuclear weapons companies. And they have an actual affidavit that every company that does business with Oakland has to sign, saying that they have nothing to do with nuclear weapons. And that's a great example. I mean, these are the kinds of things that you can do in the United States and not in many other countries. Cities don't have that kind of power in the UK, for example, but they do in the United States, and states have even more power and even more influence because, you know, cities maybe have contracts for police radios and computer systems and so on, which they are refusing to do with these companies. But states may have airports, highways, you know, massive billions of dollars worth of projects that go to these companies. And if they say they're not going to do business with them, that's a real potential force. My own city of Northampton, Massachusetts, recently passed, I mean, and again, this took a lot of steps, But they passed a law which says that they will not do business with any of these companies, and the mayor wrote to all the companies saying that they can no longer apply for contracts with the city of Northampton. And the thing is, and then this is an example of a state where this is Massachusetts. Again, there's legislation pending in the state of Massachusetts to divest and refuse contracts with the nuclear weapons companies. And it's not likely to get passed this year, but the movement is building for these kinds of laws, and these could have a huge impact within the United States. And just to give you a sense of what's possible, these are there are more than 200 cities and towns across the United States that became nuclear-free zones in the 1980s, and many of them, well, some of them are just resolutions with no real legal force, but many of them have are ordinances and bylaws which have legal force. Many of them are divested or preventing contracts or other steps to put pressure on these companies, and so there's a lot to build on, and there's certainly no shortage of ways that people can get connected to this kind of movement and support it, whether it's in the United States or in Europe or anywhere in the world. We've got a lot of work to do, but we can use these pressures on the companies to get results. And it's happened in the past. I mean, in the 1980s, I have a whole history of looking at how the companies were impacted in the 1980s from these kind of pressures. And just to give you an example, General Electric, which was at the time the largest corporation in the United States, the largest of any corporation, as well as the largest defense contractor, was a very big player in the nuclear weapons business in the 1980s, producing parts for all the missiles that the U.S. was producing then. And there was a national campaign to boycott General Electric products. And they made light bulbs for every single citizen of the United States. More than 2 million people were involved in boycotting General Electric light bulbs. And hospitals started boycotting their products. There's a whole film about this. I mean, stores were refusing to stock General Electric products. Hospitals were, General Electric was making MRI, scanning machines costing millions of dollars, which these hospitals were refusing to buy. And General Electric pulled out of the nuclear weapons business in, I think, 1988. And they said, today, if you Google General Electric nuclear weapons, you'll find on their website a statement saying we have nothing to do with nuclear weapons. So even today, they care about their public opinion that they don't want to have anything to do with nuclear weapons. So this is a powerful tool, and we finish a lot of our talks about this kind of work, talking about we're all in favor of peace. We want a world that's not got nuclear weapons or wars and violence in it. But we don't just need a dove of peace. We need a dove with teeth. And that's what we've got with the nuclear ban treaty and these international laws, these tools of putting pressure on the companies with boycotts and divestment. It's going to take teeth. And we've got the tools to do that. So I'll stop there and open it up for discussion. Thanks. And if you want to order the book, there it is.